When the call came that my son had broken his spine on a ski slope in a Minnesota blizzard, I raced through the storm like a man possessed. I was the best spinal surgeon this state had ever trained. If anyone could save him, it was me. But the second I walked into that clinic and looked at his films, I realized the horrible truth. My son's spine was perfect, and he was about to break mine permanently. Hello everyone, welcome to this story. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And just a quick note, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any similarities in names or places are purely coincidental. The evening had been quiet in the way only a Minnesota winter can manufacture. A silence so dense it felt like the snow was swallowing the world whole. I am Harold Crane, a 70-year-old retired spinal surgeon who spent 4 decades straightening the crooked architecture of the human vertebral column. I thought I understood structural failure. I thought I could read the fractures in anything. But the one fracture I never saw coming was the one growing inside my own bloodline. My home on Lake Minnetonka sat dark and still, the frozen lake beyond the windows a sheet of polished obsidian under the December sky. The only sound was the low mechanical hum of the heating system pushing warm air through the vents, and the occasional crack of ice settling on the roof. I was sitting in Ruth's chair, the worn blue velvet one she had claimed for 37 years of marriage. 2.5 years after her death, I still could not bring myself to sit anywhere else in the evenings. The faint ghost of her lavender hand cream lingered in the fabric, a scent that had become my only companion in the dark hours. The landline screamed, a shrill electronic violence that split the silence like a surgical blade through skin. I lurched forward, my reading glasses clattering onto the oak side table, my heart already hammering before my hand even reached the receiver. Nobody calls a landline at 9:43 on a Tuesday night, unless the world is ending. The voice on the other end was female, clinical, and devastatingly precise. She identified herself as Dr. Patricia Novak from the Eagle Ridge Emergency Clinic near Lutsen. Her words came in sharp, measured bursts, designed to convey maximum urgency while maintaining professional control. Your son, Spencer Crane, has sustained a catastrophic spinal fracture on the North Face Black Diamond Run. He is currently immobilized with suspected C4 vertebral burst fracture and progressive neurological deficit. We need you here immediately, Dr. Crane. C4. The word hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. In my 40 years of practice, a C4 burst fracture meant one thing: paralysis. Complete, irreversible, life-altering paralysis from the neck down. My son would never walk again. He would never hold a scalpel again. He would never embrace his future children with arms that could feel their warmth. Is he breathing on his own? I managed, my voice a fractured whisper that I barely recognized as my own. The question was reflex, the surgeon in me calculating airway compromise before the father even had time to weep. He is currently on assisted ventilation, Dr. Crane. We are stabilizing him for potential emergency decompression, but our facility is limited. Your expertise would be invaluable. I was already moving. The phone clattered back into its cradle as I lunged for my coat, my fingers shaking with a violence that made the simple act of finding my sleeve feel impossible. The smell of cold wool and cedar from the closet flooded my senses as I dragged the heavy winter coat over my shoulders. My mind was a hurricane of anatomical calculations. C4 burst with neurodeficit meant we had hours, maybe less, before the swelling permanently crushed the cord. I stumbled past the kitchen counter, and in my peripheral vision, I caught it. The steel door of my floor safe in the study was slightly ajar, just a sliver of black showing where it should have been flush and locked. I had not opened that safe in weeks. The observation registered as a cold pebble dropping into the boiling ocean of my panic, instantly submerged and forgotten. My son was dying. Nothing else existed. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the garage door, the brass cold and biting against my trembling fingers. As I passed the kitchen table, I saw the amber bottle of vitamins Spencer had brought me last Tuesday, sitting beside my morning coffee mug like a faithful daily companion. He had been bringing me those supplements for 4 months now, every single week without fail. A good son looking after his aging father. That is what I told myself. That is what any father would tell himself. Ruth's photograph watched me from the hallway table as I rushed past. Her smile, frozen in silver frame, seemed to follow me with an expression I could never quite read. Was it love? Was it warning? Take care of Spencer, she had whispered from that hospital bed 2.5 years ago, her fingers like paper in mine. He is all we have left. Promise me, Harold. I promised. God help me. I promised with every cell in my body. And that promise was now dragging me through the door, into the howling throat of a Minnesota blizzard, toward a clinic in the mountains where my son lay broken. The garage door groaned open, and the wind hit me like a wall of frozen glass. Snow was falling in thick, diagonal sheets that turned the streetlights into blurred yellow ghosts. I climbed into my black Volvo, the leather seat cold enough to bite through my trousers. The engine turned over with a reluctant growl, and I threw it into reverse before the windshield had even begun to clear. I did not know that the safe had been opened by the same hands that packed my vitamins. I did not know that the voice on the phone was reading from a script my son had written 3 weeks ago. I did not know that I was driving into the mouth of a wolf wearing my son's smile. All I knew was that Spencer was broken, and I was the only one in this state who could put him back together. The Volvo hit the road, tires fighting for grip on the ice-slicked asphalt, and I pointed it north toward the mountains, toward the trap, toward the longest night of my life. Interstate 94 was a river of black ice, stretching north into the kind of darkness that swallows headlights whole. The Volvo's high beams cut through the blizzard in short, useless bursts, illuminating nothing but a wall of white that seemed to press against the windshield like a living thing. I was driving at 73 miles per hour in conditions that demanded 40, and the rational part of my brain, the surgeon's brain that calculated risk with cold precision, had been completely overridden by the howling animal of fatherhood. The wipers slashed back and forth in a frantic rhythm that could not keep pace with the accumulation. Each stroke cleared a momentary window into the void before the snow reclaimed it, and I found myself leaning forward, my chest nearly touching the steering wheel, as though proximity to the glass could somehow bring Spencer closer. The tires hummed a discordant note against the road surface, a vibration that traveled up through the steering column and into my forearms like a warning from the earth itself. A memory surfaced unbidden, sharp as a scalpel. Spencer at 8 years old, his small body crumpled at the bottom of our driveway, blood streaming from both knees where the bicycle had betrayed him on a patch of gravel. I had scooped him up, feeling the hot wet of his tears soaking through my shirt as he buried his face in my neck. "Fix it, Dad," he had sobbed, his faith in my hands as absolute as gravity. "You can fix anything." And I had. I cleaned the wounds, applied the butterfly strips with the precision of a man who sutured spinal dura for a living, and I told him what I believed with my entire soul. "As long as I am breathing, Spencer, nothing will ever truly break you." That promise echoed now in the dark cabin of the Volvo, mixing with the howl of wind that found every seam in the vehicle's frame. I was coming. The best spinal surgeon Minnesota had ever produced was coming for his boy, and God himself would have to stand aside. I fumbled for my phone in the center console, my fingers numb and clumsy despite the heater blasting at maximum. I needed to call Megan. Spencer's fiancée would be panicking, alone in their downtown apartment, probably already racing to the same clinic in her own desperate fury. Megan Harlow was 31, a marketing coordinator with sharp cheekbones and sharper ambitions, who had entered Spencer's life 18 months ago with the swiftness of a closing deal. I had never felt fully warm in her presence, but I attributed that chill to the natural possessiveness of a father watching his only son choose a partner. The phone rang 5 times before she answered. Her voice came through the car speakers with a slight delay, filtered and thin in the way that Bluetooth connections distort intimacy. "Megan, it is Harold. Spencer has been in an accident on the mountain. A spinal fracture. I am driving to Eagle Ridge Clinic now." There was a pause. Not the gasp of a woman hearing her future husband might be paralyzed. Not the sharp intake of breath that precedes a scream. Just a pause. Smooth. Calculated. A beat of silence that lasted exactly long enough for someone to remember their lines. "Oh my God, Harold." "Oh no," she said, her voice rising in a pattern that felt rehearsed, like an actress hitting her mark on the second take. That is terrible. I will come right away. Dr. Soren is excellent, though. Spencer is in good hands." My foot eased slightly off the accelerator. The name landed in my consciousness like a pebble on still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Dr. Soren. I had not mentioned a doctor's name. The woman on the phone had said Dr. Patricia Novak. I had not spoken the name Victor Soren to anyone. Not to Megan. Not to the empty rooms of my house. Not to the steering wheel I was white-knuckling through a blizzard. "How do you know Dr. Soren's name?" I asked. My voice suddenly stripped of its earlier desperation, replaced by something colder, something clinical. Another pause. This one jagged at the edges, the silence of a person who has just heard their own mistake echo back at them. Spencer mentioned him before. His regular doctor up there. He goes skiing at Lutzen all the time. Harold, you know that. I did know that. Spencer had been skiing Lutzen since college. But a regular doctor at a remote emergency clinic? That was not how emergency medicine worked. You did not have a regular emergency physician the way you had a regular barber. The logic was wrong. The architecture of her explanation had a crack in it, hairline thin, but visible to a man who had spent 40 years examining structural integrity. And something else, her voice. When a woman learns her fiancé may never walk again, there is a texture to the grief that cannot be manufactured, a rawness, a wet, ragged edge that cuts through every syllable. Megan's voice had none of that. What it carried instead was something I could not name in the moment, but would later recognize with devastating clarity. It was the sound of relief, the sound of a woman who already knew the outcome and was merely performing her role in the sequence. "I will meet you there," she said quickly, and the line went dead before I could press further. The silence that followed in the cabin was louder than the storm. I stared through the windshield at the hypnotic swirl of snow in my headlights, turning the word over in my mind like a foreign object found in a patient's scan. Soren. How did she know? The question was a splinter beneath my skin, too small to address in the emergency of the moment, but impossible to ignore completely. Then the road vanished beneath me. A sheet of black ice, invisible beneath the thin powder, caught my front tires, and the Volvo began to rotate with a slow, sickening inevitability. The world outside became a carousel of white and black, headlights sweeping across the guardrail, across the trees, across a semi-truck's horn blaring from somewhere in the spinning void. I gripped the wheel with both hands, fighting the instinct to brake, remembering the physics that my panic kept trying to override. Steer into the slide. Steer into the slide. The tires caught asphalt again, with a jolt that snapped my head forward. The semi roared past, with a wall of displaced air that rocked the Volvo sideways, and I was breathing again, my chest heaving, the acrid taste of adrenaline flooding the back of my throat. 3 seconds. For 3 seconds, I had been a passenger in my own death, spinning toward the concrete median at 68 miles per hour. I steadied my hands, forced my breathing into a pattern. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The same rhythm I used before the first incision of a 12-hour surgery. Control. Precision. One variable at a time. In the rearview mirror, barely visible through the curtain of snow, a single pair of headlights maintained its distance. The same headlights that had been there since the interchange at Plymouth. Constant. Patient. Matching my speed with an exactness that could not be coincidental. I pushed the thought away. My son was dying in a mountain clinic, and I was the only one who could save him. Everything else, the name on Megan's lips, the headlights in my mirror, the strange cold certainty growing in my gut, would have to wait. The green highway sign emerged from the blizzard like a ghost. Lutzen, 37 miles. Eagle Ridge Clinic. Next exit. I pressed the accelerator toward the floor, pointing my life directly at the mouth of the mountains, where the lights of a fake clinic glowed like a predator's eyes through the storm. The Eagle Ridge Clinic materialized from the blizzard, like a wound in the mountainside. A squat, concrete structure, crouching at the base of the ski resort access road, its windows glowing with a sickly amber light that barely penetrated the wall of falling snow. I abandoned the Volvo at the entrance, the engine still ticking its metallic protest as I threw the door open and the full force of the mountain wind tried to push me back into the vehicle. I fought through it, the snow biting into my face like grains of frozen sand, and I hit the glass doors with both palms. They slid open with a hiss that sounded wrong, too quiet, too smooth for a facility that should have been in the controlled chaos of a spinal emergency. I stepped inside, and the first thing that struck me was the smell. It was not right. 40 years in hospitals had calibrated my nose to the specific chemical signature of an active medical environment. Betadine, isopropyl alcohol, the metallic undertone of fresh blood on stainless steel. The warm biological musk of human bodies under stress. Eagle Ridge Clinic smelled like none of these things. It smelled of industrial bleach, a thick, overwhelming concentration of sodium hypochlorite that burned the inside of my nostrils and coated the back of my throat. It was the smell of something being erased, something being scrubbed away before it could be found. The reception area was nearly empty. A single attendant sat behind a high counter, a young man in forest green scrubs whose eyes moved too slowly from his computer screen to my face. There was no triage nurse rushing toward me with intake forms. No sound of monitors beeping in adjacent rooms. No distant murmur of a surgical team coordinating over an open cavity. The silence was surgical in its precision, a carefully constructed absence of sound that felt more like a theater waiting for its audience than a medical facility managing a catastrophic injury. "My son," I said, the words tumbling out between ragged breaths. "Spencer Crane. He was brought in from the North Face. Spinal fracture. Where is he?" The attendant looked at me with an expression I could not read. "Room 7, he said, his voice flat and devoid of the urgency that should accompany a C4 burst fracture patient. "Down the hall, second left. Dr. Soren is with him now." I did not wait for further directions. I was already moving, my wet boots squeaking against linoleum that was too clean, too polished for a mountain emergency clinic that should have had mud and blood tracked through its corridors. The hallway stretched before me in a long fluorescent tunnel, the overhead lights buzzing with an uneven frequency that made the walls seem to pulse. I passed 3 examination rooms, all with their doors open, all completely empty. No patients. No equipment humming. No evidence of the organized pandemonium that a spinal emergency demands. Something was wrong. The analytical architecture of my surgical mind was beginning to assert itself through the fog of paternal terror. I had operated in field hospitals, in understaffed rural clinics, in disaster zones where the floor was more blood than tile. I knew what emergency medicine looked like in its rawest form, and this was not it. This was a stage. A set dressed to look like a clinic but missing the essential biology of actual medical practice. I reached room 7. The door was partially open, and through the gap I could see the blue-white glow of a diagnostic light box mounted on the far wall. A single X-ray film hung on its surface, backlit and glowing like a dark altar. The room itself was empty of people. No Spencer on a backboard. No Dr. Soren monitoring vitals. Just the film, waiting for me. I pushed the door open and crossed the room in 3 strides. My eyes locked onto the radiograph with the automated precision of 4 decades of pattern recognition. The cervical spine was displayed in standard antero-posterior and lateral views, the vertebral bodies stacked in their familiar column of bone and shadow. My surgeon's gaze began its assessment at cone and descended. Cone. Atlas vertebra. Normal alignment. No fracture line. C2. Axis. Dens intact. No displacement. C3. Body height preserved. Posterior elements intact. C4. The alleged fracture site. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cold surface of the film. The vertebral body was pristine. Cortical margins smooth and unbroken. No burst pattern. No fragment displacement. No canal compromise. The posterior ligamentous complex was perfectly aligned. The spinous processes marching in orderly formation like soldiers on parade. C5. Perfect. C6. Perfect. I continued down. C7. Tone. Every single vertebra from the base of his skull to the bottom of his lumbar spine was immaculate. There was no fracture. There was no injury. There was no evidence that this spine had ever suffered so much as a minor strain, let alone a catastrophic burst fracture with neurological deficit. The film was pristine. My son's spine was perfect. The realization did not arrive gradually. It detonated. A cold explosive charge in the center of my chest that sent shrapnel outward through every assumption, every belief, every piece of trust I had constructed around my only child. If Spencer's spine was intact, then there had been no accident. If there had been no accident, then the phone call was a fabrication. If the phone call was a fabrication, then why was I standing in this empty room, alone, in a mountain clinic that smelled of bleach and deception? My hands began to tremble. Not with fear. Not yet. With a cognitive dissonance so profound it felt like a seizure. My brain refusing to process the data my eyes were delivering. I turned from the light box, scanning the room with new eyes. The examination table was dressed with a fresh sheet, but there were no restraint straps, no monitoring leads, no IV pole. The crash cart in the corner was a prop. I could see from 6 feet away that the defibrillator pads were still in their factory packaging, never opened. The oxygen tank beside it had no flow regulator attached. This was not a clinic. This was a killing floor dressed in medical white. I took a step backward toward the door, my surgical brain now calculating exit routes instead of vertebral angles. And in that moment, before my foot completed its arc, a hand clamped over my mouth from behind. The grip was strong, calloused, and smelled of latex gloves and antiseptic soap. I was pulled backward with a force that lifted my heels from the floor, dragged through the doorway and into a dark supply closet that I had passed without noticing. The door clicked shut behind us, and the blackness was absolute. A voice, female, urgent, barely a whisper, pressed directly into my ear with a desperation that vibrated against my skin. "If you want to live past the next 5 minutes, Dr. Crane, you will not make a sound. Your son is not injured. He is waiting for you. And if he finds you in that room before I get you out of this building, you will never leave this mountain alive." The darkness of the supply closet was suffocating, a black so complete that I could not see my own hands. The woman's grip loosened from my mouth, but her fingers remained locked around my forearm with an intensity that communicated a single, unmistakable message. Do not move. The smell of sterile gauze packaging and industrial disinfectant pressed in from every direction, the shelves of the narrow closet creating a coffin of medical supplies around us. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely a vibration in the back of my throat. My surgical mind was already cataloging the sensory data. Female, late 20s or early 30s, based on the strength of her grip and the rhythm of her breathing. Medical professional, evidenced by the latex and soap scent on her skin. Terrified, evidenced by the micro-tremor in her fingertips that she was trying and failing to control. "My name is Nadia Volkov." She breathed, her lips so close to my ear that I could feel the heat of each syllable. "I am a registered nurse. I took a contract position at this clinic 3 weeks ago, and what I found here made me stay. Not for the paycheck, Dr. Crane. For you. Because I recognized the pattern." "What pattern?" My eyes were adjusting. I could make out the faint outline of her face now. Sharp features. Dark hair pulled back severely. Eyes that reflected the thin strip of light seeping under the door with an almost feral alertness. "The pattern of a harvest," she replied. The word landed between us like a dropped scalpel. "Your son Spencer and the man he calls Dr. Soren have been planning your death for weeks. The accident is fake. The clinic is staged. You were supposed to walk into that room and find Spencer on a backboard, sedated and dying. Your paternal instinct would override everything. You would demand to assist. They would offer you scrubs, a sterile field, a chance to save your boy. And the moment you were gowned and distracted, Soren would inject you with enough midazolam to put you into a chemical sleep you would never wake from. Midazolam, a benzodiazepine sedative. I knew its pharmacokinetics the way I knew my own heartbeat. Onset in 2 to 3 minutes intravenously. Respiratory depression at high doses. Death by hypoxia within 15 minutes without intervention. Clean. Quiet. Untraceable in a man my age whose blood already showed signs of chronic benzodiazepine exposure. The exit strategy, she continued, her voice dropping even lower, is to load your body into your own car and push it off the cliffside of Highway 61. The road conditions tonight are perfect. Black ice. Zero visibility. No witnesses. A 70-year-old man, disoriented by the stress of his son's emergency, loses control on a mountain road. Tragic, natural, accidental death pays double on his insurance policy. My chest felt as though someone had placed a hydraulic press over my sternum and was slowly cranking it closed. Every word she spoke had the ring of truth. A truth so monstrous that my mind kept trying to reject it, the way a body rejects a foreign organ. This was Spencer, my boy. The child I caught when he fell off jungle gyms. The teenager I coached through organic chemistry. The man I funded through medical school with every dollar I had saved for retirement. How do you know all of this? I demanded. The question forced through a throat that felt lined with ground glass. Because they did the same thing to my father 10 years ago. Her voice cracked on the word father, a hairline fracture in her composure that revealed the depth of what drove her. David Volkov. He was an electrical engineer in St. Paul. 59 years old. Healthy. The target of a son-in-law who owed Victor Soren $400,000. They staged a cardiac event at a private clinic. My father walked in to help his daughter's husband, and never walked out. Soren made it look like a massive coronary. I was 19. I have spent the last 10 years becoming a nurse for the sole purpose of getting close enough to this man to prove what he is. The weight of her revelation settled into my bones like lead. This was not an isolated act of filial greed. This was an industry. A service provided by a predator in a white coat to desperate men who saw their fathers as nothing more than a balance sheet waiting to be liquidated. I need to see, I whispered. I need to see him. Nadia hesitated, then guided my hand in the darkness toward a narrow gap between two shelving units. Through it, I could see a thin vertical strip of the corridor beyond. She adjusted my position, angling my line of sight toward a window that looked into what appeared to be a staff break room at the far end of the hall. The fluorescent light from inside spilled through the glass in a warm rectangle that illuminated the hallway floor. And there he was. Spencer stood in the center of the break room with his back to the window. He was not on a backboard. He was not intubated. He was not paralyzed. He was standing with the easy, athletic posture of a man who had never known a single day of spinal compromise. His shoulders were squared, his weight balanced evenly on both feet, and he was holding a tumbler of what looked like bourbon in his right hand. The cervical collar, that was supposed to be immobilizing his fractured neck, was nowhere on his body. Then I saw it. Spencer reached down to the small table beside him and picked up the rigid cervical orthosis. The same white plastic brace that should have been the only thing preventing permanent spinal cord damage. He held it up, examined it with a smirk, and tossed it into the waste bin beside the door with the casual contempt of an actor discarding a costume piece after the final curtain. Beside him, a man I did not recognize leaned against the counter. Tall, silver-haired, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation. He wore a white medical coat over dark clothing, and his body language radiated the calm authority of a man who controlled every variable in his environment. Victor Soren. It had to be. He was speaking to Spencer with the relaxed gestures of a colleague, not a physician attending a critical patient. On the counter between them, catching the fluorescent light with a cold medical gleam, sat a prepared syringe. The barrel was filled with a clear liquid, and even from this distance my eyes could read the label on the vial beside it. Midazolam, 15 milligrams. enough to stop an elderly man from breathing, without leaving a mark that any coroner would question. Spencer said something I could not hear through the glass. Soren laughed. My son raised his bourbon in a toast, and the two of them clinked their glasses together over the instrument of my death. I watched my son celebrate the murder he had not yet committed, and something fundamental inside me shifted. A tectonic plate of trust that had been the foundation of my identity as a father cracked along its full length, and the man I had been 10 minutes ago fell into the fissure. Spencer turned his head slowly toward the window. His eyes swept the darkened corridor beyond the glass with a lazy, predatory attention that made my blood turn to slush in my veins. For one eternal second, his gaze seemed to lock directly onto the gap between the shelves where my face was pressed against the cold metal. I stopped breathing. My lungs burned. The silence in the closet was so absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat and was terrified that he could too. Then his eyes moved on, dismissing the shadows as empty, and he turned back to Soren with another laugh that vibrated through the glass and into the marrow of my bones. The image of Spencer's healthy, laughing face burned behind my eyelids as Nadia guided me deeper into the supply closet, away from the gap in the shelves. My back found the cold cinder block wall, and I slid down it until I was sitting on the concrete floor, my legs no longer willing to support the weight of what I had just witnessed. The darkness pressed in, and in that darkness, my mind did what it always does under extreme duress. It retreated to the last place it felt safe. Ruth. The memory arrived not as a gentle fade, but as a violent cut. The kind that happens in surgery when you slice through the final layer of tissue, and suddenly the pathology is exposed in all its terrible clarity. 2.5 years ago. Room 412 at Street. Paul General Hospital. The smell of institutional linens, and the chemical sweetness of morphine hanging in the recycled air. Ruth was propped against 3 pillows, her silver hair spread across them like a halo that had already begun its departure from the physical world. She was supposed to recover. A routine total knee replacement. The surgery had gone perfectly according to Dr. Kenneth Park, the anesthesiologist. But something had gone wrong in the post-operative period. A sudden respiratory arrest that the team attributed to an idiosyncratic reaction to sevoflurane. 1 in 50,000 cases, they told me. An anomaly, a tragedy without a villain. I had accepted this explanation because I was a surgeon, not an anesthesiologist. Because I trusted the system I had spent my life serving. Because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. In those final hours, Ruth's hand was a dry leaf in mine. The IV lines trailing from her wrist, like puppet strings being slowly released. Her eyes, those sharp green eyes that had read my moods for 37 years before I knew them myself, found mine with a clarity that defied the morphine. Take care of Spencer, Harold. Her voice was a thread being pulled through a needle. He is troubled. I see something in him that frightens me sometimes. But he is our boy. Promise me you will never let him fall. I pressed my lips to her knuckles, tasting the sterile salt of the hospital on her skin. I promise, Ruth. I will never stop catching him. She smiled then. A smile that carried something I misread as peace, but now understood was resignation. As if she knew her warning would not be heeded. As if she understood that a father's love is the most exploitable blindness in the human condition. She was gone before dawn. I held her hand as the monitors flatlined, the sound a single sustained note that I would hear in my dreams for the rest of my life. Spencer had been there too, standing at the foot of the bed with tears streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking with what I believed was uncontrollable grief. He had leaned into me afterward, his face buried in my shoulder, and I held him the way I held him when he was 8 years old, with bloody knees. I held my son, while he wept over the mother he had killed. The thought hit me now like a defibrillator shock in the dark supply closet. The tears had been real that day. But were they grief, or were they relief? The relief of a predator who had just eliminated the one person who saw through his mask. I forced the memory forward. 6 weeks ago, a Sunday afternoon, Spencer had driven up from the city in his silver BMW, arriving unannounced with a bottle of expensive Cabernet and a manila folder that he placed on the kitchen table with the casual precision of a man setting a trap. "It is just a standard policy, Dad." He had leaned back in the kitchen chair, his long surgeon's fingers wrapped around the wine glass. "Guardian Atlantic, 5.5 million, with an accidental death, double indemnity rider. At your age, it is practically required estate planning." I had looked at the paperwork, my reading glasses sliding down my nose. The premiums were staggering for a man on a pension. I told him this. His expression had shifted then, a micro flicker of irritation that vanished so quickly, I questioned whether I had seen it at all. "I will cover the premiums, Dad. Consider it my investment in your peace of mind. You know what happened to the Hendersons when Frank died, without proper coverage. Martha lost everything. He had used Ruth against me, without saying her name. The fear of leaving chaos behind. The fear of being a burden, even in death. I signed the policy with a hand that trembled slightly from what I attributed to age, but now recognized as the early symptoms of chronic benzodiazepine poisoning. The vitamins. My mind snapped to them with the sudden focus of a surgeon identifying the source of a hemorrhage. 4 months ago, Spencer had arrived at my door with a concerned expression and a brown paper bag from a boutique supplement store. "Dad, you have been looking tired. Your complexion is off." I talked to a colleague in geriatric medicine, and he recommended this specific formulation: B12, magnesium, folate. Take one every morning with breakfast. I had been touched by the gesture. A son noticing his father's decline. A doctor applying his knowledge to protect the man who raised him. I took those capsules every single morning for 4 months, washing them down with the coffee I brewed in Ruth's old percolator. And every single morning, I was swallowing a carefully calibrated dose of lorazepam, designed to make me foggy, confused, forgetful. Designed to make the neighbors notice my decline. Designed to give Spencer the ammunition he needed to file a guardianship petition claiming I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. The fog I had attributed to grief. The misplaced keys I blamed on age. The moments of disorientation that made me grip the kitchen counter and wait for the world to stop spinning. None of it was natural decay. All of it was my son's chemistry, administered with a smile and a kiss on the forehead every Tuesday evening. I remembered the way he stayed after delivering the vitamins each week. An hour, sometimes 2, always insisting I rest while he cleaned up. "Rest, Dad. You look exhausted. Let me handle the dishes." And while I dozed in Ruth's chair, drugged into compliance by his weekly cocktail, what was he doing? Going through my files? Copying my signatures? Accessing my banking passwords from the tablet on the kitchen counter? The safe. The realization was a cold spike driven through my temple. The safe I had noticed standing ajar as I rushed out tonight. Spencer had a key. I had given him a copy years ago, trusting him with access to the family documents, the deed to the house, Ruth's jewelry, her engagement ring, the safe deposit box key. I sat in the darkness of that supply closet, my spine pressed against the wall that my son had faked breaking, and I felt the full architecture of his betrayal lock into place around me. It was not a sudden crime of opportunity. It was a building, a structure engineered over months, with the patience of a predator who understood that the strongest traps are built with love. When it is your own blood handing you the pill, you do not check the label. You just swallow and say thank you. Because what kind of father suspects his son of poisoning him? What kind of man examines a gift of vitamins under a microscope? The kind who wants to live, I realized. The kind who finally understands that trust without vigilance is not love. It is suicide by installment. Maggie Holt had lived 3 houses down from us on the Cliff Road since 1981. She and Ruth had been the kind of friends who spoke on the phone every morning at 7, who shared a vegetable garden along the property line, who knew each other's secrets the way old books know their shelves. When Ruth died, Maggie had shown up at my door every Tuesday with a casserole dish and a refusal to let me eat alone. She was 68, sharp as a surveyor's pin, and she noticed everything. Everything. I was wondering when you would start asking questions, she said, her golden retriever pulling gently toward the harbor railing where the seagulls gathered. Her thermos steamed in the cold air, the scent of dark roast mixing with the salt breeze. I have been watching that house of yours for months, Walter, and I have been biting my tongue bloody. I felt my chest tighten. What have you seen, Maggie? She looked out at the harbor, her jaw set in that particular New England way. That means a person has made a decision and will not be moved from it. That woman, your daughter-in-law, she has been meeting a man at the harborside bar since last spring, long before Nathan disappeared. Maggie's voice dropped lower, though there was no one within 50 yards of us. Tall man, 50s, charcoal overcoat, expensive watch, drives a black Mercedes SUV, always checking his phone like he is running a business meeting instead of having a drink. The black SUV, the same vehicle that had followed me from Graham's office yesterday. I kept my face neutral, but my hand instinctively moved toward my coat pocket where my phone sat with the recording app one tap away. I pressed it through the fabric. The red light would be blinking inside the pocket now, capturing every word. How often? I asked. Every Tuesday and Thursday. Like clockwork. They would meet at 6, sit in the back booth, and leave separately. Always separately. Stephanie always came home before you would notice she had been gone. Maggie sipped her coffee, her eyes hard. I know what an affair looks like, Walter. I watched my own husband conduct one for 3 years before I caught him. But this was different. They were not touching each other like lovers. They were leaning over papers, pointing at things, planning. What looks like romance from a distance sometimes reveals itself as warfare under magnification. Did you ever hear a name? I asked. Brant. She called him Oliver once when they were leaving, and he snapped at her for using his name in public. Maggie shook her head, her silver hair catching the weak morning light. But that is not the part that kept me up at night, Walter. She turned to face me fully, and I saw something in her expression that I recognized. It was the same look I had seen in my own mirror that morning, the look of someone who has been carrying a terrible knowledge alone for too long. There was a young man, early 20s, sandy hair, worked on Nathan's crew. I saw him 3 times at the old shipyard on the South Portland side, always after dark, always meeting the same man in the Mercedes. She paused, letting the weight of it settle. The 3rd time, they embraced. Not like friends, Walter, like family, same jaw, same walk, same way of standing with their weight on their left foot. Colton. She was describing Colton. The young deckhand Nathan had mentioned on the tape. The one who had sabotaged the fuel valve. And Maggie was telling me what Nathan had already confirmed. Colton was Oliver Brant's son. When was the last time you saw them together? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. 3 days before the storm that took Nathan's boat. Maggie's voice cracked slightly, the first break in her composure. I almost called you that night. I almost called the Coast Guard. But what was I going to say? That I saw a man hugging a boy in a parking lot? She looked down at her dog, her free hand trembling on the leash. I did not have the words for what I was seeing until it was too late. I reached out and placed my hand over hers. The leather of the leash was cold and damp between our fingers. You have the words now, Maggie. And I am listening. She straightened, the steel returning to her spine. There is more. 2 weeks after Nathan disappeared, I saw the Mercedes parked outside your house at 2 in the morning. The tall man went in through the back garden gate. Stephanie let him in. Maggie looked at me with a fierceness that reminded me so much of Ruth it made my throat ache. Whatever is happening in that house, Walter, it did not end when Nathan died. It escalated. I thanked her. I told her I was handling it. I asked her to keep watching and to write down anything she noticed with dates and times. She promised she would, gripping my arm with surprising strength before turning back toward the cliff road with her dog. Is there anything more powerful than an old woman with a window, a memory, and a reason to pay attention? I sat in my Volvo for 10 minutes after she left, staring at Nathan's map spread across the steering wheel. The 7 red points stared back at me like a constellation waiting to be connected. Point 1 had given me the forged documents. Maggie had given me the human context. the eyewitness foundation that transformed suspicious paperwork into a narrative of conspiracy. But Nathan had numbered the points for a reason. Each piece built on the one before. Point 2 was at the Portland Public Library. Point 5 was the shipyard Maggie had just described, the place where Oliver and Colton met in the dark. I wanted to drive there immediately, to rip the truth out of that place with my bare hands. But Nathan had been specific, in order, one at a time. I looked at the map coordinates for point 2. The library. Nathan had hidden something in the main room, the local history archive where I had spent hundreds of hours during my career researching property boundaries and deed histories. He had hidden it in a place that was mine. A place where a retired cartographer walking through the stacks would be invisible. I folded the map carefully, pressing the creases flat with my thumbnail, and pulled out of the parking lot. The fog was lifting, and for the first time in days, the pale disk of the November sun was visible above the Portland skyline. It offered no warmth, but it offered clarity. And clarity was the only currency I could afford. 2 down, 5 to go. And the shipyard was waiting. We retreated from the crawl space the way we came, every inch a controlled agony of silence. My knees screamed against the aluminum, and the fiberglass left my forearms burning with invisible splinters. But pain was irrelevant now. Pain was just data, and data was what I needed. Back on solid ground, Nadia led me to a small office behind the nursing station. The room was barely larger than a walk-in closet, occupied by a single desk, a swivel chair with a torn vinyl seat, and a desktop computer whose tower hummed beneath the desk with a faint blue glow. The monitor was dark, but not off. A screensaver bounced geometric shapes across the black surface. Soren uses this terminal to access his financial network, Nadia whispered. I have watched him log in twice. He thinks no one is paying attention to a contract nurse. I sat in the chair, feeling the cold vinyl against my back. The keyboard was dusty, the keys yellowed by nicotine and neglect. But the system was connected. That was all that mattered. I moved the mouse and the screensaver dissolved, revealing a standard medical records interface. The login prompt blinked at me like a patient heartbeat. My credentials. 40 years at Street Paul General had given me administrative access to the regional medical database, a system that connected hospitals, clinics, and insurance networks across Minnesota. My retirement had not revoked those credentials. Budget cuts meant the IT department rarely purged inactive accounts. I typed my old employee number from memory, the digits as familiar as my own birthday, and pressed enter. Access granted. The system opened like a wound, and I began my digital autopsy. I navigated first to the banking portal linked through the clinic's administrative interface. Soren had been sloppy. His bookmarks included direct links to financial institutions, and through a shared network drive, I found a folder labeled simply Crane. Inside were PDF statements from my joint account with Spencer, the emergency fund I had maintained since Ruth's death, for what I called family contingencies. The numbers destroyed me more efficiently than any syringe could have. 4 months of systematic extraction, transfers in jagged, deliberate chunks ranging from $12,000 to $45,000 each time to avoid the automatic reporting threshold. The total withdrawn was $890,000. Nearly every dollar I had accumulated in 4 decades of 12-hour surgeries, of missed vacations, of hands that ached from holding retractors steady while other men slept. I scrolled further. A mortgage document bearing my forged signature showed that the Lake Minnetonka house, the house where Ruth taught Spencer his first piano scales, where we hosted 37 years of Thanksgiving dinners, had been refinanced with a second lien of $420,000. The funds were routed to an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Crane Legacy Holdings. The irony of that name was a blade between my ribs. A linked document revealed my rare medical book collection. 32 volumes I had spent decades hunting through estate sales and antiquarian dealers had been sold in a single lot to a private buyer in Chicago for $68,000. Ruth had given me the first volume on our 5th anniversary, a first edition Gray's Anatomy from 1858. She had saved for 2 years to afford it. Each discovery was a layer of tissue being peeled away, exposing the rot beneath. I found a reverse mortgage application filed 3 weeks ago against the house, bearing a power of attorney that Spencer had somehow obtained. The signature authorization used Ruth's social security number as the secondary verification, a number that should have been deactivated and buried with her. He had resurrected his dead mother's identity to rob his living father. The desecration was so complete, it felt almost artistic in its cruelty. I opened the pension portal next, my fingers moving with the cold mechanical precision of a surgeon debriding a wound. A recurring transfer had been established 4 months ago, siphoning $1,200 monthly from my retirement account into the joint account that Spencer was simultaneously draining. He had created a closed loop, a financial Ouroboros where my future fed his present and both ended in my death. The final entry was a pending transaction, a wire transfer of the remaining balance of my home equity line, scheduled to execute at 9 tomorrow morning. The exact hour Spencer and Soren had planned for my injection. By the time the coroner was examining my body at the bottom of Highway 61, my bank accounts, my house, my pension, and my legacy would already belong to a dead woman's stolen number and a son who never deserved any of it. I scrolled to the bottom of the account summary. Current available balance, $47.23. I stared at that number until the screen blurred. $47. That was the value Spencer assigned to the man who paid his medical school tuition, who covered his failed real estate ventures, who held his mother's hand while she died, so that he could stand at the foot of the bed and calculate his next withdrawal. $47.23. Nadia appeared in the doorway. Her eyes read my expression, and she did not ask what I had found. Instead, she placed her hand on my shoulder. The simple human contact cutting through the digital horror with a warmth that nearly broke me. "We need to copy everything," I said, my voice a dry rasp against the hum of the computer tower. I pulled the USB drive from my coat pocket, the small device I always carried for transferring medical literature between my home and the hospital library. Tonight, it would carry the autopsy report of my own financial murder. I inserted the drive. The progress bar began its crawl, and as the files transferred, one final document appeared in the queue that made my blood crystallize. It was a pre-arranged contract with a cremation service. Prepaid. My name. Scheduled for the day after tomorrow. Immediate cremation upon death. No autopsy. No toxicology. No evidence. He had not just planned my death. He had planned to burn the proof. The USB drive blinked its steady blue rhythm as the last files transferred. I should have pulled it and run. Every second in that room was borrowed time with a predator's interest rate, but my surgeon's compulsion to understand the full pathology drove my fingers deeper into the file system. I needed to know the why beneath the what. Spencer was greedy, yes, but greed alone did not explain the industrial precision of this operation. Something else was driving him. Something with teeth. I found it in a subfolder labeled VS Private, buried 3 directories deep in the clinic's shared network. The folder contained not medical records, but financial ledgers, spreadsheets with hundreds of entries, organized by date, event type, and payout ratio. I recognized the formatting immediately. These were not patient charts. They were betting slips. Thousands of them. NFL games, college basketball, international soccer, horse racing. The amounts ranged from $500 to $80,000 per wager, and the losses column was a hemorrhage of red numbers that made my medical book collection look like pocket change. The account holder listed at the top of each ledger was not Spencer. It was Victor Soren. But as I scrolled through the transaction history, I found a secondary tab labeled Client Accounts, and there, alphabetized between Crawford and Dempsey, was the name Crane, Spencer J., with a running balance that made my throat constrict. $1,512,000. Outstanding. Spencer did not just gamble with Soren, he owed Soren. The man preparing my lethal injection was not merely a hired killer. He was my son's creditor. The anesthesiologist moonlighting as a bookmaker who had let Spencer dig his own financial grave until the only shovel left was the one aimed at my chest. I scrolled deeper into Spencer's account. The earliest entries dated back 18 months, coinciding precisely with when Megan Harlow had entered his life. The bets were modest at first. 2,000 here, 5,000 there. The pattern of a man testing the waters with the confidence of someone who believes intelligence can outrun probability. But the losses compounded. Spencer chased them with the desperation of an addict, doubling and tripling his stakes until the mathematical certainty of ruin became unavoidable. A separate tab revealed Megan's name. Harlow Megan R. balance outstanding, $214,000. She was not just Spencer's fiancée, she was Soren's client too. Two gamblers drowning in the same shark's pool, clinging to each other while planning to use my corpse as a life raft. Then I found the correspondence. A chain of encrypted messages between Soren and Spencer dating back 11 weeks. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion, written in the shorthand of men discussing logistics rather than murder. The earliest message from Soren read, "Your account has exceeded our tolerance threshold. Standard collection protocols will be initiated on December 15th, unless alternative liquidation is arranged." Spencer's reply, sent 40 minutes later. My father carries a $5.5 million Guardian Atlantic policy with accidental death rider. I can deliver him to a controlled environment within 6 weeks. What is your professional fee? Soren's response, consultation fee, $1.5 million. Operational expenses covered by client. Non-refundable deposit of $50,000 required to reserve the date. I will provide the venue, the pharmacological protocol, and the post-event documentation. You provide the patient. Patient. He called me a patient. The word was a scalpel that cut in every direction. I was not a father being betrayed. I was a line item in a ledger, a body being processed through a system designed to convert love into liquidity. I provide the patient. My son typed those words. He pressed send. And then he probably poured himself a glass of wine and slept soundly through the night. Nadia had been reading over my shoulder in silence, but now her breathing changed. It stuttered, caught, stopped entirely for a beat that lasted too long. I turned and saw her face illuminated by the blue screen light. The color had drained from her skin so completely that she looked like a ghost materializing from the monitor's glow. Victor Soren, she whispered. The name left her mouth like a blade being drawn from a wound. I knew him as Dr. Anderson. He used a different name in St. Paul, but the face in that staff photograph on the wall. She pointed to a framed image I had not noticed, hanging beside the door. A clinic team photo, dated this year. Soren stood in the center, white coat, professional smile. That is the man who killed my father. Her voice was barely a vibration in the air. David Volkov. 10 years ago. Same method. Same type of victim. An older man with assets, lured to a medical facility by a family member in debt. My brother-in-law owed him $300,000. My father was worth $600,000 in life insurance. He went in for chest pains that were manufactured by the same stress his son-in-law was causing. He never walked out. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white against the laminate surface. For a moment I thought she would collapse. The 10 years of suspicion that had driven her to become a nurse, to take this contract, to crawl through ceilings in the middle of a blizzard, were all being confirmed by a spreadsheet. The grief was old, but the evidence was new, and the combination was a chemical reaction I could see happening behind her eyes. He is not just a killer for hire, Mr. Crane, she said, her voice hardening as the grief was pressed into something colder, something with edges. He is a system, a business model. He finds desperate people who owe him money and offers them a way out. Their family becomes the currency. He is a harvester, and your son is just this season's crop. I looked at the screen one last time. The blue light reflected in my dry, burning eyes. I thought Spencer was the architect of my death, but he was just the construction worker. Soren drew the blueprints. Soren owned the land. And somewhere in this building, A dozen other families had been processed through this machine before mine ever arrived at the door. Soren was not just a doctor, he was a farmer. And I was this season's crop, ripe for harvesting. The USB drive's blue light went solid. Transfer complete. I yanked it from the port with fingers that trembled not from cold, but from the weight of what that small plastic device now carried. The entire architecture of my son's betrayal, compressed into 32 gigabytes. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat, pressing it against my chest where I could feel its hard rectangular edge against my heartbeat like a second pulse. We need to leave. Now. Nadia's voice was barely audible, but the urgency in it was a physical force. She had already moved to the office door, her ear pressed against the wood, listening for movement in the corridor beyond. I powered down the monitor, leaving the tower running to avoid the conspicuous silence of a system shutdown. As I pushed back from the desk, the swivel chair let out a sharp metallic squeak that froze both of us in place. The sound ricocheted off the cinder block walls, like a gunshot in a cathedral. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. The rhythmic thud of boots on linoleum, approaching from the main corridor. Not the soft-soled shuffle of clinic staff. These were the measured steps of someone conducting a patrol. Someone checking rooms. Under the desk, Nadia mouthed the words, her body already dropping to the floor with a fluid grace that belonged in a combat zone. I followed, folding my 70-year-old frame into the cramped space beneath the particle board with a grace that belonged nowhere. My knees screamed. My back compressed against the underside of the drawer unit. The smell of dust and old electrical wiring filled my nostrils. The footsteps grew louder. Paused. The door handle clicked. A shaft of corridor light cut across the floor as the door swung inward. I watched a pair of black tactical boots step into the room, their steel toes catching the ambient glow from the hallway. The boots turned slowly, scanning. I could hear breathing above us. Shallow. Bored. The sound of a man checking boxes on a list rather than hunting with intent. 3 seconds. 5. 7. An eternity measured in heartbeats that I was certain were audible to everyone in the building. Then the boots turned and retreated. The door clicked shut. The footsteps receded down the hall, like a tide withdrawing from a shore. Nadia exhaled. I counted to 30 before extracting myself from beneath the desk, every joint popping in protest. She was already at the window behind the desk, her fingers working the latch with practiced urgency. The window was small, barely 2 feet square, designed for ventilation rather than egress. But it opened outward, and the blast of Arctic air that flooded the room carried with it the smell of freedom and pine. I went first, my shoulders barely clearing the frame, as I twisted sideways and dropped 3 feet into a snowdrift that swallowed me to the waist. The cold was instantaneous and absolute, a full-body shock that stole my breath and turned my skin to fire. Nadia followed, landing beside me with considerably more grace, and immediately began moving toward the tree line 30 yards away. The blizzard was our ally now. The same storm that had nearly killed me on Interstate 94 was now erasing our footprints as fast as we could make them. Within seconds of leaving the building, the clinic was nothing but a vague amber smear in the wall of white behind us. We pushed through the snow in silence, the cold biting through my coat, my trousers, my shoes, reaching for my bones with frozen fingers. Nadia had a compass on her watch. She checked it once, adjusted our trajectory, and led us south through the forest. Pine branches heavy with snow bent and snapped around us as we forced our way through the undergrowth. The sound of wind in the treetops was a roar that drowned everything, even our ragged breathing. I could not feel my feet after the first mile. By the second, my hands had stopped shaking, which I knew from medical training was not a good sign. The cessation of shivering meant my core temperature was dropping. "Keep moving," Nadia said at once, without turning around. She did not slow her pace. She understood the same physiology I did. Stop now, and we would never start again. The trees thinned. A road appeared, its surface barely visible beneath the accumulating snow. And beyond it, glowing like a lighthouse in a biblical storm, the yellow and red sign of a Phillips 66 gas station. The fluorescent canopy over the pumps cast a harsh white circle of light against the darkness, and beneath it sat a single vehicle. A dark blue unmarked sedan with a forest of radio antennas sprouting from its roof. I collapsed against the gas station wall, my back sliding down the rough concrete until I was sitting on the cleared sidewalk. My lungs burned with each inhalation, the cold air scraping my throat raw. Nadia was beside me, her face red and wind-chapped, but her eyes already locked onto the sedan, with a recognition that told me this was not coincidence. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out into the wind. Early 40s, broad-shouldered. A charcoal overcoat buttoned to the throat over what I could see was a tactical vest. His face was sharp-featured and weathered by years of outdoor work, and his eyes found us with the immediate assessment of someone trained to evaluate threats in fractions of seconds. "Dr. Harold Crane?" His voice carried authority that cut through the blizzard's howl. "I am Detective Marcus Webb, Minneapolis Police Department, Organized Crime Division. Nadia contacted me 4 hours ago. She said you would either walk out of that clinic alive or not at all." I reached into my coat with numb, trembling fingers and pulled out the USB drive. The small device was warm from my body heat, the only warm thing left in my world. I held it out to him, and the transfer of that tiny plastic rectangle felt like passing the weight of a collapsing building from my shoulders to his. "Everything is on this drive," I said, my voice a ruin of frozen breath and exhaustion. "The murder plan, the financial theft, the gambling operation. All of it." Webb took the drive, examined it briefly, then met my eyes with a gravity that prepared me for what came next. "You are the first person to walk out of one of Soren's operations alive, Dr. Crane." His breath fogged in the frozen air between us. "I have been building a case against this man for 3 years. 6 victims before you. 6 families destroyed. And not one survivor who could testify. 6. The number hung in the air like a verdict. 6 other fathers, 6 other families fed through Soren's machine. And somewhere in that number, I already knew, was a name that would shatter the woman standing beside me. Webb opened his laptop on the hood of the sedan, the blue-white glow of the screen creating a small island of terrible illumination in the storm. Snow landed on the keyboard and melted instantly from the heat of the processor. Tiny droplets that ran between the keys, like tears the machine was shedding on our behalf. He inserted the USB drive and navigated with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been waiting 3 years for this moment. The file was labeled Operations, a simple word for a catalog of murders. The spreadsheet opened in a grid of black text and white cells, clinical and clean in a way that made the content feel even more obscene. 6 rows, 6 names, 6 completed transactions in the language of commerce applied to the business of ending human lives. Each entry contained columns for the victim's name, age, date of operation, method of termination, referring client, fee paid, and a final column labeled simply Status. Webb turned the screen toward us. "I need you both to look at this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man about to deliver wounds he could not suture afterward. "If you recognize any names, tell me now." I read from the top. Gerald Hoffman, 63. Cardiac event. Staged clinic. Referred by son-in-law Marcus Hoffman. Fee $110,000. Status completed. Date, 6 years ago. Thomas Ainsley, 71. Respiratory failure. Home visit. Referred by daughter Patricia Ainsley Moore. Fee $95,000. Status completed. 4 years ago. Each name was a life reduced to a single row of data. A man who had once blown out birthday candles and argued about politics at Thanksgiving, compressed into 8 columns of text. I felt the weight of their ghosts gathering around the laptop screen, drawn to the blue light like moths to a flame that had already consumed them. The 4th entry. I heard Nadia's breathing change before I even reached the name. A sharp intake. A cessation of rhythm. The sound of a woman whose entire body had just become a single exposed nerve. David Volkoff, 59. Cardiac arrest, private clinic. Referred by Anton Kessler. Fee $120,000. Status completed. 10 years ago. Nadia did not scream. She did not collapse. What she did was worse. She went completely still, her body locking into a rigidity that I recognized from operating rooms when a patient's autonomic system shuts down under catastrophic shock. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, on the letters of her father's name glowing in that sterile blue font, and the muscles of her jaw worked beneath her skin as though she were trying to chew through iron. "I knew it," she whispered. The words were not triumph. They were the sound of a wound being confirmed after a decade of phantom pain. I knew he did not just die. I knew it. And there it is. $120,000. That is what my father's 60 years of life were worth to these people. I reached for her shoulder, my frozen hand finding the solid warmth of her coat. She flinched at the contact but did not pull away. I understood her pain in a way that transcended language, because I was about to feel its twin. Webb scrolled down. The 5th entry. The 6th. And then my world ended for the second time in one night. Ruth Crane, 67. Perioperative respiratory arrest, sevoflurane overdose during routine total knee arthroplasty. Referring client, S. Crane. Fee $95,000. Status completed. 2.5 years ago. The words did not register as language at first. They were just shapes on a screen, black marks that my visual cortex processed without engaging the centers of meaning. Then the shapes became words. And the words became a truth so monstrous that my body rejected it the way organs reject incompatible tissue. Ruth. My Ruth. My wife of 37 years. The woman whose hand I held as she died. The woman whose death I had mourned every single day since, watering her garden and talking to her photograph and sleeping on her side of the bed just to feel the memory of her warmth. Murdered. Not by disease. Not by complication. By my son. For $95,000. S. Crane. Spencer. He had referred his own mother to this machine. He had paid $95,000 from her own trust fund to have Victor Sorin overdose her with sevoflurane during what I was told was a routine knee replacement. He stood at the foot of her bed and watched the monitors as her oxygen levels dropped, knowing exactly what was happening, having paid for every second of it. And Dr. Kenneth Park, the anesthesiologist who was blamed, the man whose career was destroyed overnight, whose medical license was revoked, whose name was dragged through malpractice proceedings for 2 years until the shame and isolation drove him to swallow every pill in his medicine cabinet 6 months later. Park was innocent. Park was a scapegoat manufactured by Sorin's system to absorb the suspicion and close the investigation. Spencer had killed his mother and then stood by while an innocent man was destroyed by the aftermath. My legs gave out. Not a dramatic collapse. A slow mechanical failure, like a building settling into its own foundation after the supports have been cut. I sat down in the snow beside the sedan's rear tire, the cold wetness soaking through my trousers without registering as sensation. The laptop screen still glowed above me, Ruth's name burning in blue phosphor against the night. I carried his coffin of lies on my shoulders for 2.5 years. I wept on the arm of her murderer at that funeral. He leaned into me with those practiced tears, and I held him, comforted him, told him we would survive this together. And the entire time, his hands still carried the chemical residue of his mother's last breath. Webb crouched beside me. His face was grim but not without compassion. The detective who had spent 3 years chasing paper trails had just watched the case become flesh and blood and broken men sitting in the snow. Dr. Crane. His voice was quiet, respectful of the devastation. This drive gives us everything. The financial records, the client communications, the operational logs. Combined with your testimony as a surviving victim, we can take down Sorin, your son, and everyone connected to this network. But I need you standing. I need you functional. Because in approximately 4 hours, Spencer is going to realize you are not dead. And when that happens, this mountain becomes the most dangerous place in Minnesota. I looked at my hands. The hands that had repaired thousands of spines. The hands that had held Ruth as she left this world. The hands my son had poisoned and robbed and planned to render permanently still. I curled them into fists against the snow, feeling the burn of ice crystals against my palms, and I stood up. My son killed his own mother for $95,000, and I carried the weight of his grief on my shoulders for 2.5 years, never knowing that the tears soaking through my shirt at her funeral were just another performance from a boy who learned early that his father's love was the easiest lock to pick. Webb did not wait for dawn. Within 40 minutes, 3 unmarked vehicles materialized from the storm, 8 officers in tactical gear emerging into the snow-covered parking lot of the Phillips 66. He briefed them in clipped sentences that carried no wasted syllables. I stood beside Nadia at the edge of the light, watching these men prepare to end the longest night of my life. The cold had become irrelevant. I was operating on nothing but the $95,000 price tag on Ruth's life. The convoy moved in silence toward the clinic, headlights extinguished. Webb positioned teams at 3 entry points. I was ordered to remain in the vehicle. This was no longer my operating theater. The breach came at 2:17 in the morning. A concussive bang, followed by the splintering crack of the main door being taken by a battering ram. Voices erupted in the night. Police. Nobody moves. Hands visible. Down on the ground. Through the windshield, I watched the clinic windows strobe with tactical flashlights sweeping room to room. Then Webb's voice crackled through the radio. Soren is in custody, 2 staff detained, but we have a runner. South side. Male, heading toward the maintenance garage. Spencer. I knew it before confirmation came. My son had been watching, calculating his exit the moment the first door shattered. A dark figure burst from the rear of the clinic, sprinting through knee-deep snow toward a maintenance structure uphill. The tactical team was seconds behind, but Spencer had the velocity of a cornered animal. The garage door flew open. A snowmobile engine screamed to life, and a single headlight blazed through the darkness as the machine exploded from the structure in a spray of powder. Spencer was hunched low over the handlebars, pointing directly up the mountain toward the Black Diamond descent on the north face. He is heading for the summit trail, Webb called. If he reaches the county line, we lose jurisdiction. All units pursue. But the pursuit vehicles were parked at the main road. By the time they mobilized, Spencer would be over the ridge. I watched his headlight climbing the mountain, growing smaller against the white slope, and felt the same helpless terror I had felt watching Ruth's monitors flatline. Then, the mountain delivered its verdict. The Black Diamond Run at Lutsen is not a ski slope. It is a scar cut into granite, a near-vertical descent through old-growth pine that drops 800 feet in less than half a mile. In a blizzard, at night, on a snowmobile driven by blind desperation, it is a death sentence written in physics. The headlight reached the summit ridge, hung there like a star balanced on the mountain's edge, then plunged downward. The engine pitch changed as gravity seized command. The light jerked violently left, then right, carving erratic arcs through the trees. The first correction was too sharp. The track caught something buried beneath the powder. The machine bucked sideways, sending snow 20 feet into the air. The headlight pointed straight up at the sky for one frozen instant, illuminating falling snowflakes like a spotlight on a million white moths. Then it went dark. The sound reached us a full second later. Not metallic. Organic. The specific acoustic signature of a human body meeting an immovable object at catastrophic speed. A sound I had heard only once in my career, during a motorcycle trauma against a concrete barrier. The sound of structural failure in the human frame. I was out of the vehicle before I knew I was moving, pushing uphill through thigh-deep snow toward the tree line. The surgeon was in command now, overriding the father, overriding the victim. I found him 40 yards in. The snowmobile was wrapped around the base of a white pine, chassis bent beyond design tolerance. The GoPro mounted on the handlebars blinked its steady red recording light. Spencer lay face up in the snow, 3 feet from the wreckage. His eyes were open, staring at the black sky with a consciousness that told me he was alive. But the angle of his neck told me everything else. I knelt beside him. My hands moved automatically to stabilize his cervical spine, fingers positioning along the lateral masses of C4 and C5 with 4 decades of muscle memory. I palpated the spinous processes, feeling for the step-off deformity that would confirm what my eyes already knew. There it was. C5, C6. Complete fracture dislocation. The vertebral body displaced anteriorly, crushing the spinal cord between fragments with an irreversible finality that no surgery could undo. I had diagnosed this injury 100 times. I had delivered this verdict to 100 families. Now I was delivering it to myself. Dad. Spencer's voice was a thin, wet whisper. His eyes found mine, wide with animal terror, stripped of every layer of charm. I cannot feel my legs. I cannot feel my hands. Dad, please. Fix it. You can fix anything. The same words. The same 8-year-old boy, with bloody knees on the driveway. But I was no longer that father. And this break was not a scraped knee. This was the kind of fracture I had spent 40 years telling families could never be repaired. The kind where the only honest answer is the one that destroys hope permanently. I looked down at my son. The man who faked a broken spine to murder me was now lying in the snow with a genuinely broken spine, begging the only surgeon qualified to help for a repair that physics would not allow. The GoPro camera recorded every second. The same system Spencer had installed to document my death was now documenting his own permanent destruction. The irony was not poetic. It was gravitational. The universe completing a circuit with a precision that no human engineer could have designed. 1 week. 7 days of fluorescent-lit waiting rooms and institutional coffee, and the rhythmic scratch of detective pens on legal pads. 7 days of my body slowly purging the chemical leash my son had wrapped around my brain for 4 months. The fog was lifting. Colors were sharper. Sounds had edges again. And with the clarity came a fury so cold it felt like a second winter settling into my marrow. I sat in the toxicology lab at Hennepin County Medical Center, the same building where I had performed 312 spinal surgeries over the course of my career. The irony of returning here as a patient, rather than a physician, was not lost on me. The phlebotomist had drawn 4 vials of blood that morning, the dark red liquid filling the vacuum tubes with a sound like whispered accusations. Detective Webb sat across from me in the consultation room when the results arrived. He slid the paper across the table with the careful precision of a man delivering a verdict. I read the numbers the way I once read imaging studies. Systematically, without emotion, saving the interpretation for after the data was fully absorbed. Chronic benzodiazepine exposure. Lorazepam metabolites detected at levels consistent with daily oral administration over a period of approximately 16 to 20 weeks. Concentrations insufficient to cause acute toxicity, but sustained at levels known to produce cognitive impairment, memory disruption, psychomotor slowing, and behavioral changes mimicking early-stage dementia in elderly patients. The vitamins. Every amber capsule Spencer had handed me with that concerned smile and that practiced furrow of his brow every Tuesday evening for 4 months. B12 and magnesium, he had said. A colleague recommended it. The capsules were not supplements. They were a slow-acting erasure of my cognitive identity, calibrated with medical precision to make me appear incompetent, without killing me outright. He needed me alive long enough to sign papers, confused enough to not question what I was signing. Webb opened a second folder. This one contained a legal document filed with Hennepin County Probate Court 11 days ago. A petition for emergency healthcare guardianship, submitted by Spencer J. Crane, M.D., on behalf of his father, Harold W. Crane, citing rapid onset cognitive decline, episodes of confusion and disorientation reported by neighbors, and an inability to manage personal and financial affairs. Attached were 3 witness statements from residents of my Lake Minnetonka neighborhood. Mrs. Johansson claimed she saw me wandering my driveway in a bathrobe at 2 in the morning, unable to locate my front door. Mr. Peterson stated, I had forgotten his name during a conversation despite knowing him for 15 years. Each statement bore signatures that looked genuine. Each described symptoms that the lorazepam had manufactured with chemical precision. The petition requested that the court appoint Spencer as my legal guardian with full authority over medical decisions, including end-of-life directives. The hearing was scheduled for December 19th, 4 days after my planned murder. A hearing I would never have attended because I would already be ash in an urn, cremated without autopsy by a prepaid service that asked no questions. He built the legal scaffold for my death before he built the physical one, I said. The words tasted like copper in my dry mouth. If the clinic had worked, the guardianship petition would have retroactively justified everything. A demented old man, a tragic accident, a grieving son who tried to help. Webb nodded. It is airtight, Dr. Crane. Or it would have been, if you had not survived. The detective then reached for his phone and pressed play on a recording. Soren had taken the plea deal that morning, trading a life sentence for 45 years with the possibility of parole. His confession was clinical, detached, delivered with the emotional register of a man reading a grocery list. Soren's voice filled the small room with its flat, accented monotone. The Crane procedure was contracted 11 weeks prior to execution. Spencer Crane approached me with the proposal after his outstanding balance exceeded $1.5 million. I offered the standard resolution protocol. He selected the high-value insurance liquidation option, with supplemental cognitive impairment preparatory phase. Supplemental cognitive impairment preparatory phase. My son had drugged me into appearing insane, and Soren had a branded name for the service. Webb fast-forwarded. The recording jumped to the portion I had been dreading since I first saw Ruth's name on that spreadsheet. Regarding Ruth Crane, Soren continued. The procedure was contracted 2.5 years prior to tonight's operation. Spencer Crane approached me regarding a $1.2 million trust fund that required Ruth Crane's death to trigger early disbursement. The method selected was perioperative anesthetic overdose during a scheduled elective surgery. I administered a supplemental bolus of sevoflurane during the maintenance phase of her total knee arthroplasty at St. Paul General, inducing respiratory arrest that mimicked a rare, idiosyncratic, anesthetic reaction. I sat motionless. The recording continued. Spencer Crane was present in the facility during the procedure. He accessed the patient monitoring system remotely via the nursing station terminal in the adjacent hallway. I received confirmation from him via text message that the patient's oxygen saturation had dropped below critical threshold. His response was, and I am quoting directly, "Good. Let it finish. I am going to the cafeteria." The room went silent. Webb stopped the recording. The detective's face was carefully neutral, but I could see the strain around his eyes. 3 years of investigating financial crimes had not prepared him for the sound of a son ordering his mother's death by text message and then walking away to eat. I stared at my hands on the table. These hands had held Ruth's hand as she died in that hospital room. These hands had stroked her hair and whispered promises into the silence of her final breath. And 20 feet away, my son had been watching a screen, waiting for numbers to drop, then typing 7 words before going to lunch. Good. Let it finish. I am going to the cafeteria. 7 words. The eulogy Spencer truly wrote for his mother. Not the sobbing performance at her funeral. Not the trembling lip and the black suit, and the way he gripped my arm at the graveside. 7 words on a phone screen, typed while her lungs filled with gas and her heart tried to beat in a body that was already being surrendered. And Kenneth Park, the anesthesiologist whose name was destroyed, whose license was revoked, whose wife left him, and whose children stopped calling, who sat alone in a studio apartment for 6 months, before swallowing every prescription in his medicine cabinet, because the weight of a crime he did not commit had crushed him flat. Park was Soren's scapegoat, a convenient absorber of blame, selected because he had been the attending anesthesiologist that day, and because dead men cannot appeal their malpractice verdicts. Spencer watched his mother's heart stop from 20 feet away. Then he walked to the cafeteria and ordered a turkey sandwich. He was hungry. 5 months moved like a glacier. Slow, heavy, grinding everything beneath its weight into a fine powder of legal motions, depositions, and pretrial hearings that consumed my days with the relentless monotony of a hospital ventilator. I spent those months in a furnished apartment downtown, a temporary space that smelled of new carpet and someone else's life. The lorazepam had fully cleared my system by the third week, and with its departure came a mental clarity, so sharp it felt like waking from a coma. Colors returned, memories sharpened, and the full scope of what had been done to me became brutally, luminously visible. The morning of the trial, the courthouse steps were slick with April melt. I climbed them in a charcoal suit I had purchased for the occasion, my only concession to the theater of justice. Inside, the marble corridors of Hennepin County District Court echoed with the footsteps of attorneys and journalists, the sound bouncing off stone walls that had witnessed a century of verdicts. Courtroom 3. Judge Patricia Holmgren presiding. The heavy oak doors swung open, and I entered the space where my son's life would be measured against the lives he had taken. Spencer was already there. Wheeled in on a motorized gurney, his body strapped at the chest and thighs, a rigid cervical brace immobilizing what remained of his shattered neck. A portable ventilator hummed beside him, connected to the tracheostomy tube that now governed his every breath. The C5, C6 fracture had severed his spinal cord completely. He was quadriplegic, dependent on the machine for respiration, capable of moving only his eyes and the muscles of his face. The charcoal suit he once wore to board meetings and casino backrooms had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit modified with Velcro closures for a body that could no longer dress itself. I took my seat in the gallery. Our eyes met across the courtroom. His were filled with something I could not name. Not remorse. Not shame. Something closer to the look of a chess player who has lost his queen and is calculating whether any moves remain. When I was called to the stand, I placed my hand on the Bible and swore the oath with the same steady precision I once used to mark incision sites. The prosecutor guided me through the events of that night. The call, the drive, the X-ray, the crawl space, the list. I spoke without embellishment, delivering each fact the way I once delivered surgical reports. Clean, sequential, irrefutable. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination. A tall woman named Kathleen Bryce, whose reputation for aggressive advocacy preceded her into every courtroom. She approached the stand with the measured stride of a predator selecting an angle of attack. Dr. Crane, is it true that you were experiencing significant cognitive decline in the months prior to this alleged conspiracy? She asked, her voice carrying the courtroom with effortless projection. I was experiencing symptoms consistent with chronic benzodiazepine intoxication administered without my knowledge or consent, I replied. The toxicology report confirms this. I was not declining. I was being poisoned. She pressed further, suggesting I had self-medicated with sedatives due to depression following my wife's death. That the financial transfers were legitimate gifts to a struggling son. That my testimony was colored by paranoia and grief. I reached into the folder beside me and produced the document that ended her strategy. A printout of Spencer's gambling account with Sorin, showing 147 individual bets placed over 18 months, totaling losses of $1.5 million. Time-stamped. IP verified. Cross-referenced with the exact dates of every financial transfer from my accounts. These are not the actions of a grieving father hallucinating conspiracies, I said, looking directly at the jury. These are the receipts of a son who bet his father's life on a roulette wheel and lost. Bryce had no redirect. She returned to her seat with the posture of a woman who understood the case had just ended. The prosecution played the GoPro footage from the snowmobile. The courtroom watched Spencer's own camera record his flight from justice and subsequent crash. Then they played Sorin's recorded confession. The clinical voice describing Ruth's murder filled the silent courtroom like poison gas. Several jurors looked away. One covered her mouth. The foreman stared directly at Spencer throughout, his expression hardening with each sentence. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with a folded paper that contained the weight of 6 lives and 1 attempted murder. On the count of attempted first-degree murder, of Harold Crane. Guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Ruth Crane. Guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of David Volkov. Guilty as an accessory. On the count of grand larceny. Guilty. On the count of forgery and identity theft. Guilty. Each word landed like a surgical staple closing a wound. Spencer's mouth moved. His jaw worked against the ventilator's rhythm, trying to force sound past the tracheostomy tube. But the machine would not yield to his schedule. It breathed when it chose to breathe. And between its mechanical cycles, my son's protests were nothing but silent shapes, formed by lips that no longer commanded anything. Judge Holmgren delivered the sentence without ceremony. Consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole on the murder and attempted murder charges. Additional 25 years for financial crimes. To be served in the medical infirmary of the Minnesota Correctional Facility at Oak Park Heights, Victor Soren received 45 years. Megan Harlow, tried separately 2 weeks later, received 20 years for conspiracy and accessory charges. As the bailiffs prepared to wheel Spencer from the courtroom, his gurney passed within 6 feet of my seat. The ventilator hissed its rhythm. His eyes locked onto mine. His mouth moved, forming words that the machine refused to voice. But I read his lips with the same precision I once used to read spinal imaging. This is not over, Dad. Even paralyzed. Even convicted. Even breathing only because a machine forced air into his lungs. The mathematics of murder still calculated behind those eyes. I held his gaze without flinching, and said nothing. There was nothing left to say to a stranger wearing my son's face. 2 weeks of silence. I should have known that silence from Spencer was never peace. It was reloading. The envelope appeared under my apartment door on a Tuesday morning, slid there sometime between midnight and dawn, when the hallway security camera conveniently experienced a 4-minute gap in its recording. I found it beside my shoes as I left for my morning walk. A plain white rectangle with no return address and no postage. Hand-delivered by someone who knew exactly where I lived and exactly when I would be asleep. Inside were 3 photographs. High resolution. Black and white. Grainy in the way surveillance imagery always is, but clear enough to turn my blood cold. The first showed me handing the USB drive to Webb in the gas station parking lot. The second captured Nadia and me climbing through the clinic window into the blizzard. The third was a close-up of my face, illuminated by the laptop screen in Soren's office. Someone had been watching us that night. Someone with a camera and enough proximity to capture these moments at angles that suggested a fixed position. A fourth operative we had never detected. Beneath the photographs was a single typed page on expensive cream stationery. The letterhead read Megan R. Harlow, and the text beneath it was written with the cold precision of a woman who had spent 20 years calculating risk margins for marketing campaigns. Dr. Crane, you survived the sun. Now you negotiate with the partner. I possess comprehensive documentation of your unauthorized access to Dr. Soren's private medical systems on the night of December 3rd. This constitutes a federal crime under HIPAA and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. $300,000 transferred to the following account within 72 hours ensures this documentation remains private. Failure to comply results in immediate disclosure to the FBI Cyber Division and the Minnesota Medical Board. I read it twice. The second time, I laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the dry, exhausted laugh of a man who has been hunted so many times that the appearance of another predator feels almost nostalgic. I took the envelope directly to Webb. His office at the Minneapolis precinct smelled of lemon wax and old coffee, a combination that had become strangely comforting over the past 5 months. He examined the photographs with the focused intensity of a man seeing the final piece of a puzzle he thought was already complete. Megan Harlow was released on bail pending her conspiracy trial, he said, his jaw tightening. She has been under surveillance. But she switched phones 3 days ago and dropped off our radar for 48 hours, long enough to deliver this. Can you trace the account? I asked. "We can do better than that," he replied. "We can let her come to you." The sting was straightforward. I would appear to comply, arranging a dead drop at a downtown parking structure. Webb's team would be waiting. But Megan, it turned out, was not interested in waiting for the money to arrive at a designated location. She wanted to collect it personally, and she wanted something else entirely. She came to my apartment that night, 11:43. I was wearing the wiretap Webb had fitted beneath my shirt, its small transmitter pressing against my ribs like a mechanical heartbeat. I was in the kitchen, brewing tea I had no intention of drinking, when the front door lock clicked open with a sound that should have been impossible. She had a key. Spencer must have given her a copy during the months he was systematically dismantling my life. The lights were low. I heard her footsteps in the hallway, soft-soled shoes on hardwood, moving with a deliberate pace that carried no hesitation. She was not here to negotiate. I understood this the moment she appeared in the kitchen doorway, and I saw what she held in her right hand. A syringe. The barrel filled with a clear liquid that caught the under-cabinet lighting with a clinical gleam I recognized from 40 years of preoperative preparation. This was not midazolam. The label, on the vial, tucked in her coat pocket, read rocuronium bromide, a neuromuscular blocking agent. It would paralyze every voluntary muscle in my body within 90 seconds, including my diaphragm. I would suffocate while fully conscious, unable to move, unable to scream, aware of every second of my own asphyxiation. "Spencer sends his regards from Oak Park Heights," she said, her voice steady but her pupils dilated with adrenaline. "He told me about the offshore account in Zurich, the one Soren kept as a retirement fund. It is mine the moment you stop breathing. Consider this my severance package." She moved fast, faster than a 70-year-old man should have been able to counter. She pinned my left arm against the counter, the syringe descending toward my neck with a trajectory aimed at the external jugular. I caught her wrist with my right hand, the needle stopping 3 inches from my skin. The rocuronium sloshed in the barrel, its clear death rocking with the violence of our struggle. For 5 seconds, we were locked together, her strength against my grip, her desperation against my refusal to die. The tip of the needle grazed my throat, a cold kiss of steel that drew a thin line of blood before I managed to twist her wrist sideways. Then the door exploded inward. "Police. Drop the weapon." On the ground. Now. Webb's team flooded the kitchen. Megan was tackled from behind, the syringe flying from her hand and shattering against the tile floor. The rocuronium pooled in a small, clear puddle between the shards of glass, catching the light like a liquid diamond. She screamed as the handcuffs locked around her wrists. Not words, just sound. The raw frequency of a woman whose last gamble had come up empty. As they dragged her toward the door, she twisted her head back toward me. "Spencer has 3 more, she shrieked. 3 more people who owe him favors. You will never be safe. He will never stop." I leaned against the kitchen counter, my breath coming in shallow gasps, watching the small puddle of rocuronium seep between the floor tiles. Even from a prison bed, breathing only because a machine forced air into his lungs, my son was still reaching across the miles to stop my heart. His body was a cage, but his malice had no walls. I touched the thin cut on my throat. The blood was warm against my fingertip. 3 inches. That was the margin between life and death tonight. 3 inches, and the speed of a police response team. I looked at the broken syringe, and knew what I had to do next. Not for justice, not for revenge, for closure. I had to see him one last time, face to face, father to son, surgeon to patient. And I had to say the words that would end this permanently. The drive to Oak Park Heights took 47 minutes. I counted them in heartbeats rather than mile markers, each pulse a deliberate reminder that my cardiovascular system still answered to my brain and not to a machine. The Minnesota Correctional Facility sat on the bluffs above the St. Croix River, a sprawling complex of concrete and razor wire that looked exactly like what it was. A place designed to hold things the world had decided should never move freely again. I parked in the visitor lot, the engine ticking into silence. For a long moment, I sat with my hands on the wheel, staring at the facility's main entrance through the windshield. This was not a medical consultation. This was not a father visiting a sick child. This was a surgeon making his final rounds on a patient he had decided to discharge permanently from his care. The security process took 35 minutes. Metal detectors. Pat down. Identification verified 3 times. Belongings locked in a gray plastic bin. I walked through corridors that smelled of industrial disinfectant and recycled air, past heavy steel doors that buzzed open and clanged shut behind me with a finality that vibrated in my molars. Each door was a vertebra in the spine of this institution, and I was traveling deeper into its core. The medical infirmary wing was a separate building connected by an enclosed walkway. The air here was different, warmer, thicker with the smell of medical-grade plastics and the constant underlying hum of life support machinery. A nurse escorted me to the visitation booth, a small room divided by reinforced glass with a telephone handset mounted on each side. I sat in the molded plastic chair and waited. The glass was cold against my reflection. On the other side, the room was empty. Then a mechanical sound approached. The rhythmic electric whir of a motorized gurney, accompanied by the steady hiss-click of a portable ventilator cycling through its programmed breaths. Spencer appeared, or what remained of him. He was transported in a full reclined position, his body strapped to the gurney at multiple points to prevent the skin breakdown that complete immobility guaranteed. The cervical brace was gone, replaced by a permanent halo device screwed directly into his skull at 4 points, the metal frame surrounding his head like a crown forged in a nightmare. The tracheostomy tube protruded from his throat, connected to the ventilator by corrugated blue tubing that pulsed with each mechanical breath. A Passimure speaking valve had been attached, allowing air to pass over his vocal cords on exhale. But the sound it produced was not a voice. It was a ghost of one. His eyes found mine through the glass. They were the same brown eyes I had watched open for the first time in a delivery room 38 years ago. But everything behind them had been emptied out and refilled with something I did not recognize. The nurse positioned him in front of the glass partition and placed the telephone handset against his ear, holding it there because his hands could not. I picked up my side of the phone. The plastic was cold and greasy against my palm. Silence. Then the ventilator cycled. Hiss. Inhale. Click. Exhale. On the exhale, Spencer forced a word through the valve. Dad. The ventilator cycled again. Hiss. Inhale. Click. Exhale. You came. Each word required a full respiratory cycle. 5 seconds of mechanical breathing for a single syllable. The effort of speaking was already showing in the thin sheen of sweat forming on his forehead, the only autonomous response his damaged body could still produce. I did not come for you, Spencer, I said, my voice steady, my surgeon's composure holding like sutures under tension. I came to inform you of decisions that have been made. The ventilator hissed, his eyes narrowed. I have legally changed my surname. The name Crane no longer exists outside of your criminal record and your medical chart. When you eventually die in this facility, there will be no family to claim the body. The state will handle your disposition. His jaw worked. The ventilator cycled. Hiss. Inhale. Click. Exhale. You cannot do this. I can, and I have. The paperwork was finalized yesterday. I paused, allowing the next piece of information to find its precise surgical placement. Your medical team has submitted a request for an experimental C5 anterior cervical fusion with nerve bridge grafting. It is the only procedure that carries a theoretical possibility of restoring partial upper extremity function. Without it, you will remain in this exact state for the rest of your natural life, breathing by machine, speaking one word at a time, unable to feed yourself, turn yourself, or wipe the sweat from your own forehead. Spencer's eyes widened. The ventilator cycled, but he did not try to speak. He was waiting for what he already sensed was coming. The procedure requires a private surgical guarantor to cover the experimental costs. The hospital will not perform it under state-funded care. It requires a signature from a qualified next of kin. Cycle. Hiss. Inhale. Click. Exhale. I am the only spinal surgeon in this state qualified to consult on a C5 fusion of this complexity. My endorsement would be required for any surgical team to proceed. My signature on the guarantor form is the only thing standing between you and the possibility of ever moving your arms again. His eyes were locked on mine now with a desperation that transcended his paralysis. The ventilator forced air into his lungs, but I could see his chest straining against the straps, his body trying to do what it could no longer accomplish. His mouth formed a word that the machine had not yet given him permission to speak, and I am choosing to walk away. The word finally escaped on the next exhale, a single syllable that carried the weight of 38 years of fatherhood being severed in real time. Please. I looked at him through the reinforced glass. The man who faked paralysis to kill me. The man who poisoned my coffee and sold my home and murdered his own mother for $95,000. The man who sent Megan with a syringe of rocuronium 2 weeks ago to finish what the mountain had interrupted. No, I said. And the word was not cruel. It was not vengeful. It was simply final. The last prescription a surgeon writes when the patient has proven himself beyond saving. I hung up the handset. The click of plastic against plastic echoed in the small booth like a bone snapping. Through the glass, Spencer's mouth was moving, forming the word Dad over and over. But the ventilator was in its inhale cycle. The machine would not give him permission to voice it. And I was already standing, already turning, already walking toward the steel door that would seal this chapter permanently. Behind me, the ventilator hissed its indifferent rhythm, the only companion my son would ever have again, the only voice that would ever answer his. I did not look back. Summer arrived in Minneapolis the way it always does, sudden and generous after months of gray. The trees along Lakewood Cemetery's windy serpenting serepted in a green so vivid it felt almost aggressive, as though nature were trying to compensate for the long cruelty of winter. I walked beneath their canopy in a lightweight linen shirt, feeling the warmth on my skin with the heightened awareness of a man who had nearly been denied the sensation permanently. Ruth's headstone sat beneath a sugar maple she would have loved. Simple gray granite. Her name. Her dates. The inscription I had chosen in the fog of grief 2.5 years ago. Beloved wife and mother. A light that never dimmed. I stood before it now with the knowledge that the light had not dimmed on its own. It had been extinguished by hands that once held hers. I lowered myself to the grass beside the stone, feeling the earth warm and solid beneath me. For a long time, I simply sat, watching the shadows of leaves move across the granite like gentle fingers, listening to the distant sound of a lawnmower and the liquid song of a cardinal somewhere in the upper branches. I am sorry it took me so long to see the storm, Ruth, I whispered to the stone. I was too busy keeping a promise to a boy who did not deserve it. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope. Cream-colored, yellowed slightly at the edges, sealed with the kind of adhesive that suggested it had been closed for years. It carried the faint vanilla scent that had been Ruth's signature for as long as I had known her, a fragrance that reached across death and time and chemistry to find me in this moment. The safe deposit box key had been inside the floor safe all along. The same safe I had noticed standing ajar the night Spencer lured me to the mountain. He had been looking for something specific that night, rifling through documents for the power of attorney forms and banking credentials. But he had missed the key, a small brass object taped to the inside of the safe's door, hidden behind the felt lining. I found it 3 weeks after the trial, during the process of inventorying what remained of my possessions. The safe deposit box at First National contained only this envelope, Ruth's handwriting on the front. For Harold. When you are ready. I was ready now. I broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the single page within. Her handwriting was elegant and unhurried, the loops and curves of a woman who had taught piano for 30 years and understood that precision and beauty were not opposites. My dearest Harold, if you are reading this, then I was right to be afraid, and I am sorry I never found the courage to tell you while I could still hold your hand. I have seen something in Spencer that frightens me. It has no name that I can give it. It is not cruelty exactly. It is absence. An absence where love should live. I have watched him calculate in moments that should require only feeling. I have seen him measure people the way you measure vertebrae, looking for the weakness, the point where pressure will produce the desired result. I do not have proof of anything, only a mother's intuition, which I know you will dismiss as sentiment if I speak it aloud. So I am writing it here, in a place only you will find, at a time when perhaps the proof has found you instead. If something happens to me, Harold, look closely at how it happens. Look at who benefits. Look at who stands to inherit what I have tried to protect. And please, my love, whatever you discover, do not let guilt consume you. You loved him because that is what good fathers do. You trusted him because that is what good men do. These are not failures. They are the costs of being the man I married. I hope you always choose yourself, Harold. You were always the anchor, not the chain. Our boy may be lost, but you do not have to go down with him. All my love, across whatever distance separates us. Ruth. I read the letter 3 times. By the second reading, my vision was blurred by tears I had not shed since the night she died. By the third, I was weeping openly, my chest heaving against the warm summer air, the paper shaking in my hands. She had known, not the specifics, not the mechanism, but the essential truth of what her son was. She had seen the architecture of his emptiness, the way only a mother can, through the walls and beneath the floors, into the foundation where the rot begins. And she had been afraid to tell me because she knew I would not listen. Because a father's love is the most exploitable blindness. She had written those words knowing that I would need to read them only after the proof had arrived in a form I could not deny. She had known me perfectly, even in death. I pressed the letter against my chest, the paper warm from the sun, and I forgave myself. Not all at once, not completely, but the first fracture in the wall of guilt that had imprisoned me since the trial began to spread. Ruth did not blame me. Ruth understood. And Ruth had already said goodbye, in the only way she could. That afternoon, I drove to Street Paul General Hospital. The building had been undergoing its own transformation in the months since the trial. New leadership, new protocols, a complete restructuring of the anesthesiology department, and the patient monitoring systems that had allowed Soren to operate undetected for a decade. Nadia Volkov met me in the lobby. She was wearing a navy blazer over her scrubs, and the name badge clipped to her lapel read a title that would have been unthinkable 8 months ago. Director of Patient Safety. She had earned it the way surgeons earn their board certification, through blood, through loss, through the refusal to let the system that killed her father continue to function unchecked. We sat in her new office overlooking the hospital courtyard, the same courtyard where Ruth and I had once walked after her preoperative consultation. The Ruth Crane Foundation for Anesthetic Safety had been officially registered that morning. Its mission was simple: independent monitoring of all anesthesia protocols in Minnesota hospitals, random audits, whistleblower protections, a digital fail-safe system I had designed myself, using the same analytical precision that once guided my surgical planning. You built something permanent, Nadia said, her eyes carrying a peace I had not seen in them before. Your wife's name will protect people she never met. I looked at the foundation charter spread across her desk, Ruth's name printed at the top in clean black type, and I felt something I had not felt since before that December phone call. Purpose. Not the desperate purpose of survival. The quiet, steady purpose of a man who has finally stopped bleeding and started building. There was one last thing I needed to do before I could leave this city and everything it represented. The Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport was a cathedral of glass and steel, its vaulted ceilings catching the morning sun and scattering it across the polished floors in long geometric ribbons. I moved through the terminal with a single carry-on bag and a passport that bore a name no one in this building would recognize. The photograph inside showed a man who looked 10 years older than the one who had posed for it 7 months ago. The eyes were the same, but whatever had lived behind them before December 3rd had been replaced by something quieter, something that no longer needed to prove its worth to anyone. I passed through security without incident. The TSA agent glanced at my identification, at my face, and waved me through with the practiced indifference of a person who processes 1,000 stories a day without reading any of them. I was anonymous. For the first time in 70 years, no one in my immediate radius knew my history, my profession, my losses, or my name. The sensation was not loneliness. It was liberation. Gate C-17, Santa Fe, New Mexico, direct flight. 2 hours and 43 minutes between the city that nearly buried me and the desert that would teach me how to breathe again. I settled into a seat by the window and watched the ground crew loading luggage onto the aircraft. Ordinary men doing ordinary work under an ordinary sky. The simplicity of it was beautiful, in a way I had never noticed before. Perhaps that was what nearly dying teaches you. Not gratitude exactly, but attention. A willingness to see the world without filtering it through the lens of obligation or expectation. I reached into my pocket and touched Ruth's watch. A simple mechanical timepiece she had given me on our 20th anniversary. Silver case. Leather band worn soft by decades of daily wear. It ticked against my wrist with the steady rhythm of a heart that belonged to someone who had loved me without conditions, without calculations, without the hidden arithmetic of what I was worth dead versus alive. I wore it now not as a memorial but as a compass, a reminder that love, real love, does not keep a ledger. The boarding call came. I stood, gathered my bag, and walked down the jetway into the narrow cabin. My seat was by the window. As the engines spooled to life and the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, I pressed my forehead against the cool oval of plexiglass and watched Minneapolis slide past beneath the wing. There was Lake Minnetonka, a blue mirror set in green. Somewhere on its shore sat a house that would soon be a memorial garden. There was the courthouse where justice had been measured and delivered. There was Street, Paul General, where Ruth had been taken, and where Nadia now stood guard against the ghosts of men like Soren. And somewhere in that sprawl of concrete and glass, in a facility on the bluffs above the street, Cry River, a man who used to be my son was waiting for a machine to give him permission to breathe. The wheels left the ground. The city tilted and shrank, becoming a map, then a memory, then nothing but a texture of gray and green beneath the clouds. I closed my eyes and let it go. Looking back now from the quiet distance of months and miles, I understand that this story was never about revenge. It was never about the money or the insurance or the courtroom. It was about the moment a man stops confusing loyalty with blindness and begins to see the people he loves for what they truly are, rather than what he needs them to be. I loved my son. I loved him with the totality that only a father can, the kind of love that fills every room and forgives every failure and extends every benefit of every doubt until the doubt itself becomes a weapon turned against you. And that love nearly killed me. Not because love is weak, but because love without discernment is a door left unlocked in a dangerous neighborhood. I believe God walked beside me through that blizzard. I believe He placed Nadia in that supply closet at the exact moment my hand reached for the door that would have ended my life. I do not say this lightly, or as a man who has always had faith. I say it as a man who stood at the edge of his own grave and felt a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back into the light. There are moments in this life where the mathematics of survival do not add up, where the odds should have consumed you, and yet you stand. In those moments, I believe we are not alone. I believe God allowed me to walk through that darkness, not as punishment, but as instruction. The lesson was not about my son's evil. It was about my own refusal to see it. It was about the difference between love and enabling, between faith and denial, between holding someone up and allowing them to climb your back to reach something they intend to steal. And I believe God gave me Ruth's letter at the exact moment I was ready to receive it. Not sooner, when I would have dismissed it. Not later, when the bitterness might have calcified beyond reach. But precisely when my heart was broken enough to let the truth in and strong enough to survive it. If there is one thing I want you to carry from this story, it is this. Love your family. Love them deeply, generously, without reservation. But never abandon your judgment at the altar of that love. Watch for the signs. Trust the instinct that whispers something is wrong even when everything on the surface looks right. A family bond can hold the greatest warmth and loyalty this world offers, but it can also become the perfect camouflage for the deepest betrayals if we choose comfort over clarity. Protect yourself, ask questions, trust wisdom over sentiment. And if you ever find yourself holding a bottle of vitamins from someone whose love feels just slightly too performative, too scheduled, too insistent, put them down. Look closer. Because the people who love you honestly will never need a script. The plane touched down in Santa Fe beneath a sky so wide and blue, it looked like the first day of creation. The air outside the terminal was dry and warm, scented with sage and red earth, carrying none of the weight of lake water and old snow that had defined my life for 7 decades. I drove to a small adobe house on the eastern edge of the city, a place with thick walls and wide windows that framed the Sangre de Cristo mountains in the distance. I set my bag down in the front room. I opened the windows, and I stood there in the silence, feeling the desert wind move through the empty space, carrying nothing but heat and dust and the faint scent of juniper from the hills beyond. For the first time in my life, I did not need to save anyone. I did not need to fix anything. I did not need to keep a promise made to a ghost, or carry the weight of a name that had been used against me. I was simply a man standing in a room full of light, breathing air that belonged entirely to him. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I know it was long. I know it was heavy. But some stories need their full weight to deliver their truth. Now, I would love to hear from you. What would you have done in my position, discovering that the person you loved most had built a machine designed to erase you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story reached something inside you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. And remember, the strongest walls in your life are not the ones that keep others out. They are the ones that keep your judgment intact. Even when love tries to convince you, the door should stay unlocked.